Welcome back. This lesson will be looking at the impact that the conquest had on Mexico and the people of the area, and also looking at the concept of racism as how it's developing in the New World. So hopefully you got a chance to read about the conquest of Mexico. I gave you a small little excerpt to for you to kind of be informed about what actually took place. And I'll briefly touch on that, but I really want to look at the legacy of all this that happens because throughout history you've had people fight, right? We've had wars, but this one was very different and it's very unique because of what comes out of it. So we're going to address like into 1600, maybe a little bit into 1700s in Mexico. And we'll be kind of moving our way north. So even though we've been talking about Spain and Mexico, our intentions is really to focus on Mexican Americans on this side of the border. All right, there you see a picture of the Europeans against the native population, right, against the Aztecs. So we'll skip this. We're going to kind of look at what happens with the conquest. Again, you read about it, so you might already know some of these things. Some of these characters might stand out, right? Cortez and this person in particular, right? La Malinche. And the conquest of Mexico, to kind of bring back some of those terms that we've been, that we started off using at the beginning of the semester, this is an example of oppression, right? This is a physical attack against a group of people, right? It's not subordination. We're going to look at an example of subordination a little bit later. So when we look at Cortez, and numbers fluctuate because he came in with so many men when he first arrived to the Americas, then he went back because there was a party after him and he fought them and then he grabbed those men too. But nevertheless, right, the numbers were not that large compared to the population that was here in the Americas. So a lot of people, some people kind of question, well, how did such a small army beat such a huge army, right? And things are never that clear cut. What we find is that Cortez made alliances. A lot of people hated the Aztecs, right? It was, the Aztecs was a massive empire that demanded tribute from different regions. So it's no surprise that people supported Cortez with that kind of mentality, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So the Tlaxcalans, along with other groups, supported the Spanish. So it wasn't just Spanish against indigenous people. Also, the Europeans did bring certain technology that was unheard of in the Americas, right? Things like swords, rifles, and cannons. These things just didn't exist. Though they were not the determining factor, they did play a role in the conquest of the Americas. Another one is horses. I mentioned in the previous lecture, right, that horses at one time did exist in the Americas. They became extinct. And this was something new. What we find is that in some of the sources that the indigenous people had never seen horses. And if you ever stood next to a horse, it's a massive animal, right? It's quite scary. If it were to kick you, it would probably kill you. So the Aztecs had no word for this animal. They used to call it, I think, flying deers because it was so new to them. But obviously they're much bigger than deers, right? And this played a major psychological effect on the Mesoamericans. Just imagine a horse coming at you at full speed, right? At full charge. That would have you buckle at your knees if you were to see something like that. And then one of the readings that you had with this was this idea of La Malinche, right? In Mexico, we don't read it in this class, but I'll talk about it briefly here and there. And there's an essay called Hijos de la Chingada, and you probably heard the word. Your mom probably used it, right? And we actually do have a person that supposed to represent this chingada, and that is La Malinche, right? She's very instrumental, and you saw that in the reading to the conquest of Mexico. It is argued that without her, things wouldn't have facilitated as quickly as they did. So, Cortez probably would have been dead had it not been for her. And she's actually, the reason why we call her Isla de Chingada, because she's our mother. Cortez and La Malinche actually have a kid. His name is Martin. And then Cortez takes a kid and leaves to Europe with him, and leaves La Malinche here, and he passes her off to some other guy, some other general. And the interesting thing is that Cortez, he gets married over there in Europe, and he has another child, and he names him Martin also, right? So there's Martin 1, Martin 2. So it's quite intriguing. But nevertheless, this is the relationship between Cortez and La Malinche. For many Mexicanos and Chicanos too, this is the birth of mestizaje, right? Of mestizos, because we are the product of that. So she is our mother, right? And we find that at the battle, during the conquest of Mexico, the Battle of Tenochtitlan, I mean, this war is something very unique. The native people, typically when they fought, they really fought not so much to kill, but really to capture. They would capture people because they would sacrifice them. And the Europeans didn't fight that way. The Europeans fought to kill, so it was very unheard of. Another thing is that Europeans had different war tactics than the Mesoamericans. One thing that you see is Cortez, he surrounds Tenochtitlan with boats, and he basically starves them out. He cut off the aqueducts, obviously cuts off the food supply, and people are just starving. And for the Mesoamericans, they've never encountered a war like this. This was a cowardly war, a cowardly tactic. And unfortunately, it was successful because it starved them out and just killed them. But really, the major killer of the Mesoamerican people were diseases, right? Europeans were filthy human beings at this time. I mean, they had just gone through the Black Death a couple decades ago during this time, maybe 100 years ago, which always reappeared periodically. And the indigenous people just did not have immunity to any of these diseases. And I think we're going through that right even as we speak, right? Going through this coronavirus. So we know what these people are experiencing. Unfortunately, people have died because we have no immunity. At least, people that gotten really sick and passed away. So we know the role that biological warfare plays in the Americas during this time. Now, as the Europeans begin to colonize the Americas, here you have, a small group of people, a couple thousand, controlling all the Americas, controlling hundreds of thousands of people, right? So the question always is how the hell did they do it? How were they successful with so few people against such a massive amount of population? Well, this is where the concept of race kind of comes in and plays an important role in creating a hierarchy, right? We see that today with hierarchies, right? It's always, a few group of people that control the masses. And we always kind of go, when we look at for example, plantations and go, oh, if I was a slave, I would have fought back. It's like, well, why aren't you doing that right now? There's masses of us poor people and we do nothing, right? And there's only a few people in power. So don't underestimate these people because they're just like us. We're just as, I guess, cowardly at times too as people back then that, they're trying to survive, and so are we. And that's, we're very passive too. So don't come up with these type of arguments. I would have done something. I would have never, had them enslave me. It's like, yeah, you would have, because there's a system in place to keep people in check. And this is what happens here. As Europeans come over, they begin to create a system of privilege for certain groups of people. Not only themselves, obviously they're the ones profiting from all this conquest, but also the people that have some kind of status in the Americas. They actually intermarry into the nobility of these indigenous tribes, or they offer them certain privileges to make sure there's not a massive revolt. So a lot of this comes from La Reconquista, right? These ideas of race. During La Reconquista, as these kind of hundreds of years wars kind of go on in Spain, they develop these identities of how they see themselves. And one of them is this concept called a Cristiano Viejo, which means, if you speak Spanish, the old Christian. This idea that our forefathers fought against Muslims in order to reclaim this territory. And this becomes like a rallying cry, a very symbolic identity to the Spanish. And we see that during, particularly towards the end of the Reconquista, they begin to kind of force conversion of the people who are there. I mentioned in the previous lecture that the Moors allow people to practice their faith. They just had to pay a higher tax. Now, the Spanish are not doing it. The Spanish are saying you either convert or you die. You got two options, right? Agency, right? Use one or the other. And we find that some of them were forced to convert in order to survive, right? And in the Americas, as I mentioned a minute ago, a lot of the Spanish intermarry into the nobility, into the different classes that are there. And that's the nice way of putting it, right? That they intermarry, because some bad stuff happened to some of these women. And you see a lot of what we would call today racial mixing amongst the different groups, right? And particularly amongst the Spanish and the native population. Keep in mind that this is also during the slave trade, so they begin to bring in Africans, and then all of a sudden they're part of this mixing too. And we see something that's quite unique to the Americas, because in the United States, a little bit later, when the English come to the east coast of the United States, what is today the United States, they really don't mix that much. They really try to limit mixing. In the United States, you have a very kind of white-black dichotomy, whereas in Mexico, you have a very large, a large group of people mixing amongst each other, so much so that they create the castas. And you could kind of see it here, right? These images. We'll talk about these in a little while. And as time goes on, they begin to kind of see religion being associated with blood, because some of these Jewish people and Moorish people would not convert. The Spanish began to see it as something innate, right? Even if they did convert, a lot of Christians in Spain believed that it wasn't genuine, that they didn't really mean it. And even though they might have been like 5 generations Catholic after converting from Judaism, in the Spanish mindset, they still saw them as Jewish. Like the idea that blood is still lingering in them. Even though they might call themselves Catholic now, they're still essentially Jewish. And this is how this concept of race begins to be constructed. They call the Moors Moriscos, which is a label that's actually used here in the Americas too. And you begin to see it based on what we call phenotype. Phenotype means skin. As I mentioned earlier, right, it begins to privilege Europeans, the Caste System, and it limits the opportunity for the other people that don't have enough white blood in them, right? And you see it in these pictures. I'm going to ask you a few questions. I might have you do an activity that focuses on these Casta paintings, where I want you to interpret what you're looking at. Okay, so I don't want to give too much away, but maybe you already kind of see it here in these pictures. These are developed like in the 1700s. The painting themselves, though, the ideas of different categories are already in play. Now they begin to, like as I mentioned earlier, right? They begin during the conquest, and particularly the aftermath. They begin to bring in different groups of people, and one of them is slavery. Now, when it comes to slavery, I want you to understand that yes, all civilization have had slavery, but what happens in the Americas is very unique, something that is almost unheard of in world history. Okay. So a lot of time you hear kind of like racist people say, well, blacks enslaved themselves. That's ignorant. That's an ignorant statement, right? Because they enslaved themselves, but it's nothing like what actually took place, all right? You're taking a little snippet, a little idea, and you're making it very, like, this very grandeur argument, and that makes it very problematic. Okay, so we're going to talk about this transatlantic slave trade a little bit. First, yes, so slavery is common. It's common in Europeans, it's common in the Americas, right? Native American people enslave other, Aztecs enslave other groups, and African people enslaved other people too, but it's very different as to how it was being shaped. We find that enslavement happened because about a third of the population died. Remember that these people died of smallpox. And when the Europeans came over here, they were not coming to discover anything. They were coming to make money. Understand that somebody funded that trip for them to come to America. A lot of letters of Cortez, he was actually, he was wanted under treason because he came to Mexico without permission. But a lot of letters that he sends back to the king and queen of Spain, he's like, oh, look, I got your money, basically, don't do anything bad to me because I'm getting all this stuff for you. So when these Europeans came to the Americas, they did it not because they came to discover themselves or, they came for fun. They came to make money. And particularly if I'm financing your trip, I want my money in return. So this was called a quinto. They always had to separate a fifth of whatever they found, particularly gold and silver, and send it back to the Americas, or back to Spain. So we find that they started, the Portuguese are the first, even before the discovery of the Americas, the Portuguese began to enter the African continent and, stop in certain areas and trade with them. But then enslavement became very common by the 1440s, 1450s. And the question is like, why not Asia? Asia's just too far away. Why not America? Well, a third of the population is dying. You might go, well, a third's not too bad, Pablo. Well, if you're alive at that moment, right, it's like, well, in retrospect, it's not that bad. But at that moment, it's like, holy moly, right? That's a lot of people dying left and right. It's like today with that, with that corona. You might go, I'm sure when this is all over and we, only a small percentage of the population died, it's like, well, that's not a big deal. But right now that we're, particularly a couple months, right, when we were in the middle of it, there's a lot of people at the hospital. It's like, oh, wow, this is getting out of control, right? So at that moment, you don't know how many people are going to die. So even though a third died, which is a horrible number, right, 33%, which means 2/3 survive, at that moment, you don't know how many people are going to survive. So Europeans need that labor. Europeans were not enslaved because, for different reasons, but there was a papal bull. The Pope basically made a declaration saying you can't enslave another Christian. I don't care if they're Protestants. And that really only left Africa. Africa at this time, it's just a bunch of different tribes. It's not like an African nation or African peoples. There's just all these different tribes that, sometimes had conflicts with each other. And, like I said, they would enslave each other. But not in the way that Europeans began to enslave these people. So what causes slavery? Well, it's this new form of capitalism that emerges during this time. We're not saying that capitalism leads to slavery, because that's not the argument here. But it did kind of facilitate it because there's a need for labor in the Americas to extract the resources and send it back to Europe. So these things kind of go hand in hand. So capitalism in itself doesn't create slavery, but because there is a need for labor, because people do want to make money, particularly the people who are money hungry over here in the Americas, they needed a cheap source of labor, and slaves fill that need. Just to give you an example, it is said, I think in Bolivia, there's a mountain there that they extract all this silver, and it is argued that they extracted enough silver to build a bridge of pure silver from Bolivia to Seville, Spain, right? That's how much silver came out of this one mountain. Now, it is said that with the bodies that died extracting the silver, you could build a bridge from Seville back to Bolivia. And a lot of them were African people. They brought all these African slaves and made them work in these mines. So it just kind of shows you, right, this kind of money hungriness created this need for cheap slave labor. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, there is no such thing as an African people. So yeah, most of them were tribes, and they would have conflicts with each other, and they would enslave each other, and try and get rid of your enemy. They would sell them off to Europeans. So there was a lot of internal fighting amongst the people themselves. But again, they did not see themselves as a collective, right? So don't let like racist people say, well, they enslaved themselves. Again, that's an ignorant statement. Now this begins to impact women. At first, you don't see too many women being sent to the Americas. But I think by the 1700s, that begins to increase. About a third of the slaves tend to be women. And you have an article, I believe, either this week or next week, that looks at the sexual violence against Native American women. But it kind of works here too as to what's happening to women, particularly women of color. So, as I mentioned earlier, Cortez, even though he sleeps with La Malinche, has a kid with her, that's not good enough for him, right? He gives her away, and instead he leaves to Europe and marries a European woman. So this kind of creates a stratification amongst women of color and European women, where European women are seen as good women, good, honorable women. When we talk about a woman's honor, we tend to think of a woman's honor in regards to her sexual reproductive system. Okay, typically that's when we talk about women's honor. And is she a good virgin woman, right? Good virtuous woman. Can she give me kids? Can she reproduce? And in the context of this conquest, for many European men, only European women adhere to that value, because they can transmit property from one generation to the next, right? They have kids, and they're going to leave particularly their male heirs, whatever property is left. From the European mentality, and you'll see this in the article, women of color cannot adhere to this concept of honor and virtue, right? Because they're non-Christian. Only Christian European men marry Christian European women, and they reproduce and they have these kids. And again, the whole concept of primogeniture. Well, women of color, they're not Christian, they're not European, right? They're not white, basically. So they're not held to the same standard as European women. So we're not saying this is right, but this is what happens. So women of color are viewed as objects. They're viewed as inferior, and they're viewed as open to anybody. So anybody can just, sleep with them. And as I said earlier, Cortez sleeps with La Malinche and just gives her to somebody else. She's accessible to anybody. Eventually she dies of, I think, smallpox at the age of 26. So they were together when she was 16. So we see how women, particularly women of color, colored bodies, become viewed not as a human being, but as an object so you can reproduce. And particularly in the Americas, it is very rare in the United States. When we're forming, it's before we become a country, we're still a colony. Typically, everything goes through the male line. We've always done that, except for slavery. It's the one time where we actually go through the female line. So whatever the status of the mother is, so should follow the status of the child. So if your mother is a slave, the offspring will also be a slave. And that's a very unique thing to do, because we've never seen that. And again, in a very patriarch society, we always go through male lines. This is one of these few instances, surprisingly, right, that we go through the female line. Why? Because this is viewed as a form of capital. And what it does is basically legitimizes the rape of women of color, right? So again, when we think of things of systematic, this is a great example where society says it's okay to rape women of color. Why? Because they don't matter. They have no value in our world, particularly our European world that we're trying to create here. So women of color become easy targets during this time. And there's a lot of what we call mestizaje. And again, that's putting it mildly, because it's a horrific thing that happens to these women during this time. And it happens all, up and down the Americas, South America, Mesoamerica. you have an article that looks at Native American women in California. So yeah, it's quite horrible. All right, so as these people are reproducing, again, sometimes not by choice, you begin to see a Caste system. Now, the Americans, again, they rape Native women too, and women of color, African women, but they really try to limit racial mixing. In the Americas, not so much. In the Americas, they needed it, as I said earlier, right? It was necessary. And they create these different categories. And I'm going to name a few. I heard there was like 100. There's like a ton. At the very least, I know there's more than 30. Most paintings show about 16. But, as more people mix, more categories are created. And here you kind of see some of the names of these different categories that are here. So the first one on top are going to be the people who are coming from Spain. So if you were born in Spain and has that kind of quote unquote pedigree, then you have more value than people who are not born in Spain but are still white. So those who are born in Spain are at the top of society. Below them you have the criollo. Those are people who are basically European, but are their parents might have been from Spain, but they were born here in the Americas. So a castizo, with a pure blood, would probably make a criollo. And again, it gets really complicated. The most common one is the mestizo, right? This is a Malinche and Cortez, a white father and a native woman makes a mestizo. And you'll see that most of the white people tend to be male. Most of the colored people tend to be women. That tends to be the most common thing. There are maybe an exception here and there, but for the most part, that tends to be the rule. And it kind of works its way down, right? Albino, a Morisco, and a Spanish parent, so pure blood here mixed with a Morisco here creates an albino. However, you're still below a mestizo. And the goal is, what they're trying to do is what they would call limpieza de sangre, right? Kind of clean your blood and make you European. I was watching a lecture about the castas, and as we get later into the period 1700s, you can actually buy your way out of some of these categories, move your way up, buy some official papers. Kind of funny. You have mulatto. You kind of see you begin to see kind of black African blood, and then all of a sudden the names begin to change. This means mule, right? Morisco means more. And then you have these other categories. So if you look at some of these images and just look at them, take a quick minute just to glance at them, and then look at these categories and how they begin to change, and particularly the name usage that they have here. Ahí estás, which means there you are, right? Mulato and coyote. And then you begin to see less Spanish there. Coyote, mestizo and Indian, right? Lobo, right? Almost animal-like. Like you're going back, you're devolving into less of a human being. So you can kind of see what's happening here, right? Sambo, torna atrás, right? And that means going back. And these categories, they have real meaning. They're not just like, hey, look, guess what? I am a coyote. Isn't that fun, right? These words have real meaning because it could determine a lot about your future life, I think by the late 1700s, they began to use these categories in official documentation, particularly things like birth certificates, or baptism, by the church, when the church creates these kind of paperwork. So these words have real meaning. It could determine whether you can go to college. It could determine whether you could become a politician. It could determine whether you can enter a guild or run a business, those type of things. So these words do have real meaning. So what is the significance? As I mentioned earlier, this is that process of trying to clean your blood, take out that dark blood and try to make you white, privileging white skin, which is something that we still see in Mexico, right? People with lighter skin, we tend to go, qué bonita, salió bien güerita. And then if you have, maybe it might be you, it might be a cousin, they go, pobrecita, salió bien negrita, right? And we still have this kind of notion in Mexico. And like I said, some of our family members still privileging white skin. And when it comes to these pictures, well, understand that this is not a form of oppression. This is a form of subordination. Here we see how, this is not a physical violence upon people, but basically these pictures tell you something about your place in society. And remember that subordination refers to this concept of hegemony. It's kind of common sense. Well, I guess I'm a lobo, right? I guess I'm never going to go to college. I'm never going to enter a guild and be economically successful. So why even bother, right? And so it's a form of subordination. Nobody beat me over the head with one of these paintings to tell me this is my place. But this is me kind of saying, well, that's just the way it is. I kind of accepted it. So this is a great example of subordination. And even though it's not great, right? It's quite horrible. At the very least, it's different from, say, the way the American racial system is created. If you remember that first article that you read for the semester, that one lady that had, one drop of black blood in her, she was considered black, right? It's just one drop, right? Those mathematicians out there, right? 132 makes you black. Doesn't that mean that 32 of you is white? Why does that one drop classify you as black? That's just the American mentality, right, of race. Well, in Mexico, it's a little bit, I don't want to say better, but, at the very least, it challenges this notion of a white-black racial binary, where it might not be great, but at the very least, you're able to participate in this community in some shape or form. Obviously, if you're darker, opportunities are much more limited, but nevertheless, right, if you're somewhere in between, you might have better opportunities than, say, somebody that's black in the Americas. So, somewhat of a plus, if you want to call it that. All right. So the conquest, again, that's a kind of quick rundown of what happens in the aftermath of the conquest. But as we kind of continue, the conquest also had a religious component, and one of them is all these Jesuits and Franciscans come over, and Dominicans come to the Americas, and one of their goal is to convert many of these native populations into Christians. And Queen Isabella, she was queen when Columbus was around. That was one of her goals, that Europeans battled as to, what do we make of these people? They're not Europeans like us, but they're also not Africans. And it's Queen Isabella that kind of protected them, saying, no, these are people from the Bible, one of the lost tribes. We can convert them into Christians. And, this became a major thing. And we talked about mestizaje a minute ago in regards to the mestizaje of real people, but we also see a mestizaje of culture. So one way to help them convert is that you take symbols that the indigenous people already have, particularly for the Aztec goddess Tonantzin, right, the earth goddess, and you make them into Christian deities, right? So La Virgen de Guadalupe shows up to Juan Diego in the same place that the Aztecs used to worship, Tonantzin. And she, to some extent, embodies that, right? You can see here the sun around her. Obviously, she's a woman. And so she kind of emulates the goddess that's already, revered here in the Americas by the indigenous people. So this is one way that we see this mestizaje take place, because she's not the Virgin Mary, right? And she's not Tonantzin completely either. She's a mixture of these two things. And religion will become an important element as we move our way north, because that's what kind of helps settle some of these new establishments in places like New Mexico and California. All right. So by the 1530s, we begin to see the people from New Spain, I should say, not Spanish, migrate north, and they populate places like California and Texas, but they never really develop it. They tend to have a very pastoral economy, which means very small communities based on just sustaining yourself, a little bit of cattle, a little bit of food, populations no more than 5,000 at most. Even 5,000 would have been huge at that time. A couple thousand, maybe 2,000, and trying to settle this side of the border. All right, I already talked about Mestizaje. So what do we learn? We see this idea of mestizaje emerge, right? It's not only a physical mestizaje with people, but cultural mestizaje, where there's a lot of give and take. Without, even though the Europeans dominate politically, the culture that's created is very mixed. And we see indigenous culture survive much of this. Why? Because they're the majority. So definitely Europeans have influence, but we still see indigenous culture alive and well, way into today too. Also, we find that the Europeans came over for economic development. They brought in people because of economic development, and they create a system where it privileges Europeans, and this is where the castas kind of come in. And we see that kind of racial hierarchies being established in the Americas from this point forward. So a lot of people say, well, racism has always been around. Not necessarily. Racism is a relatively new idea that emerged around the 1500s with all this that's taking place. A lot of people say, well, the Bible, first, that's not a good reliable source. And B, they would have never thought in terms of race. It just didn't exist. It's not even an idea back then. Racial hierarchies, racial ideas are a very modern thing. So going back to that kind of postmodern argument, if we created it, we can do away with it, right? It's not real. It's not real, but it is real. Okay, we'll stop it there. And next lesson, we'll focus on the American Southwest. All right. Oh, last point here, agency, right? We see indigenous culture survive. I already kind of mentioned that with mestizaje.